Hello learners, welcome to the 36th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century Anglophone women's novel. In the previous lecture, I provided a somewhat detailed biographical and cultural context to the novel A Severed Head by Iris Murdoch. I'll continue discussing that context, and as promised, I'll take a somewhat unexpected detour into the work of a 21st century philosopher in order to better understand the structures of feeling one finds in the novel A Severed Head by a 20th century philosopher. So I'll begin by reading some quotations from John Bailey's book and then transition to an understanding of this philosophical experimentation and philosophical production by reflecting on marriage that we find in the work of Agnes Callard. So John Bailey's work of criticism actually also had a study of A Severed Head, and Bailey writes that A Severed Head is quite representative of Murdoch's work because it contains characters who suffer from the nightmares of mental awareness. And this again, I think, is reflective not so much of what we find in Murdoch, but rather what contemporary reviewers and scholars and typically male reviewers tended to find in this work. And the phrase, the nightmare of mental awareness, is very reflective of layperson's view of what it might be like to think and live a philosophical life. So the assumption here is that the problems which are presented in that satirical treatment of adultery and relationships might be a nightmare that is produced by too much thinking or too much thought. And I think this runs counter to the basic premise of most philosophical approaches to life, and the approach that can be summed up in the expression that is found in many stickers and many t-shirts and beer mugs and so, which is the examined life. The quote actually goes back to Socrates, who is famously known to have said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And the implications of living a life that is truly and seriously and rigorously examined are almost too difficult and almost unbearable to live. So the fact is that while everyone likes to say that the unexamined life is not worth living and therefore we should examine our lives, everyone stops short of truly examining their lives, because asking those fundamental questions about our lives, why are we doing what we do, and do our actions truly reflect the fundamental moral beliefs that we hold to be unimpeachable. So these questions, if we start asking them and if we really try to answer them, most of us will find that we cannot go on living, or at least we cannot go on living as we have been. So modern life requires that we put aside some of these fundamental questions. But some philosophers and some individuals strive to find the courage not only to ask these questions, but also to live their lives as if these questions mattered. And this is exactly what we find very powerfully in a book that I mentioned in the previous lecture, which is Open Socrates by Agnes Callard. Now, this book opens with a discussion of Leo Tolstoy's depression. Leo Tolstoy famously had this bout of depression late in his life when he was very successful as a novelist, was doing very well financially with his farm and his estate, and suddenly had a bout of suicidal depression. He was contemplating suicide because he could not answer some very fundamental questions that he had. Questions about kindness, questions about empathy, questions about what he was doing with his life. And Agnes Callard begins with this story with Tolstoy's depression because she finds in that episode of depression an attempt to be faithful to that philosophical inquiry. And what we find in the rest of the book is an account of Callard's own commitment to that sort of a philosophical openness. And that openness requires a great deal of courage because it demands that individuals have the capacity to think through their choices, their decisions, and to also have the courage to make radical changes in their existing living arrangements in order to better align with their fundamental beliefs. And so, in the life that Agnes Callard has lived and which she has written about on multiple occasions, there were occasions when Agnes Callard found that the institution of marriage, or at least the manner in which that institution of marriage was being practiced, and the manner in which Agnes Callard herself had reconciled herself to the conventions and the obligations and the compromises of that institution, none of those things happened to be working. And she was presented with an alternative. She was presented with an alternative in that she faced this very radical choice of ending one marriage and beginning another relationship. And she decided to approach it not simply as a person, but at least in two perspectives, both as a philosopher and as a person. This is something that Callard has written about at great length and has also given multiple interviews and is a part of many profiles and podcasts. So any of the learners is interested in this, they are more than welcome to learn about this. And essentially, the life that Callard lived in a way reads, to me at least, in the past few days as I've been thinking about a severed head and Iris Murdoch's philosophical fiction, Agnes Callard's life reads to me like as if it had the bones of the plot of a novel by Iris Murdoch. Except that it is not a novel, it is in fact her life. So, what happened and how did Agnes Callard approach it? Essentially, what happened is early in her career as a philosophy professor at the University of Chicago, Agnes Callard happened to have a conversation with a PhD student named Arnold Brooks. And they were talking about Aristotle. And at the end of a semester, when Agnes Callard had brought some cake to class, this student of hers, Arnold Brooks, confessed to her that he was in love with her. Agnes Callard later confessed that she too reciprocated that feeling, but there was nothing that they could do about it, and so they should just let it be. Later that weekend, Agnes Callard writes that she was traveling to her parents with her two young children, and she describes this experience. She describes the thought she had. For the first time in her life, she felt as if she had access to a certain inner experience of love, a state that made her feel as if there were suddenly a moral grail, a better kind of person to be. She realized that within her marriage, she didn't have this experience. If she stayed married, she would be pretending. And the words that she uses again, I thought that I would become sort of corrupted by staying in a marriage where I no longer felt like I was aspirational about it. Now, this idea that she thought it would be better not just for herself, but for others around her, if she could allow herself to be in a more aspirational state. This is the idea that becomes the thesis of her first book, which is Aspiration, which came out in the year 2018. And this idea is very important to Agnes Callard as a philosopher. And the ending of this marriage, the beginning of a new one, Agnes Callard is very aware of how it appears and the perceptual battle that she was bound to lose on all angles. And that did not deter her from actually taking the decision. In fact, that inspired her to make that decision part of her professional, philosophical work. So soon after she had taken the decision to get a divorce from her husband at the time and to enter into a relationship with Brooks, which would later turn into marriage, she gave a lecture at a philosophy conference for undergraduate students. And in that lecture, which was titled On the Kind of Love into Which One Falls, Agnes Callard writes, 6.5 weeks ago, I fell in love for the first time. You did not think I was a person who would subject her children to divorce. You did not think I was a person who would be married to someone she had not fallen in love with. You are not sure whether you know me anymore. One of the things I said very early on to my beloved was this: I could completely change now. Radical change, becoming a wholly other person, is not out of the question. There is suddenly room for massive aspiration. So, the word aspiration is repeated multiple times throughout Agnes Callard's work, and several colleagues of hers, other philosophers who have read about Callard's transformation and have seen Callard both as a colleague and a person, very powerfully inspired by how these two aspects of a philosopher's life, that is, the personal and the public, which in most professional settings, we are advised to keep separate and for good reason. But in some cases, and I think in the case of a person whose public role involves the production of knowledge, the use of language in order to produce new ideas, for some such individuals, this boundary or this neat separation between the personal and the public is not very sustainable. And in this sense, also, one can see this idea also has a very old and very rich history in feminist thinking. And the account that I find very powerful is that of Jonathan Lear, another very powerful moral philosopher at the University of Chicago, who's best known and whose favorite book, for me at least, is his book on Sigmund Freud. Jonathan Lear describes Agnes Callard's approach to life and philosophy thus: she's attempting to live a philosophical life, and this includes taking responsibility for the very concept of marriage. Part of what I take to be her bravery is that she's looking around asking, hey, I know all these couples have gotten rings and gone to the courthouse, but are they married? One thing you can do with that question is forget all about it and find some deadline to be anxious about. Or you can really hear the question vividly. That's the place where philosophy begins, with a certain anxiety about how to live the life that is yours. Agnes Callard has been known to make some very notorious statements. A couple of years ago, she tweeted, I think back when X was Twitter, she tweeted saying that philosophers don't have a need for privacy because every aspect of a philosopher's life, no matter how personal or how bodily, is actually good fodder, good fuel for the generation of new philosophy or for doing philosophy, for thinking through, for asking new questions. In 2018, at the Eastern American Philosophical Association, Agnes Callard actually gave a lecture in which she reflected on her own situation in which she had accidentally gotten pregnant without having planned to and was considering an abortion. This was the subject of her very public, very professional philosophical reflection, and these are some of the sentences that Callard wrote and spoke. I am pregnant and I don't know whether I want to be. Your shock, addressing her audience of all professional philosophers, your shock is, of course, why most of those women don't talk about it. Still less does anyone confess to being, at that very moment, engaged in the deliberate activity of weighing the value of a future human life. One thing that emerges in reading through Agnes Callard's reflection on marriage and her own interpretation of the thoughts and process by which she arrived at these decisions is that Callard approaches marriage not just as a convention or as a practice or as a legal and social contract, but also as a way of thinking. One very common shape that many people assume, and a very common metaphor that people assume marriage to take, is that of a downward sloping line. And Agnes Callard quotes from the writer and the essayist Joan Didion, who describes the downward slope of a marriage as the traditional truce, the point at which so many resign themselves to cutting both their losses and their hopes. As against this, Agnes Callard proposes a different metaphor for thinking about marriage. And the metaphor that Callard finds most useful is that of a ladder. For Callard and for Arnold Brooks, marriages need to be decoupled from traditional understandings of narrative-based decisions. lives are supposed to be narratives in which there is limited time, and the goal is to have a narrative that has a good ending. So, in this scheme of thinking about marriage, the pressure or the anxiety is on making the right decision as early as possible so that one is set, so that one is best placed and is most likely to have a conclusion in which one has a long, happy, sustainable, peaceful end of life. This is one way in which marriage is frequently described, and quite logically also from some perspectives, as a sort of a retirement plan. And Agnes Callard and her philosopher friends and former husbands, they describe this. They describe marriage not as a narrative or as a downward slope or a graph, but as a ladder. And this comes from a philosophical idea, again borrowed from Socrates. And the specific idea that Agnes Callard often borrows from Socrates to describe marriage is that of philosophy as sort of preparation for death. And to extrapolate loosely from that idea, that just like philosophy is a sort of preparation for death, Agnes Callard and her partner describe marriage as a preparation for divorce. I'll reflect on that a little bit later, but first I want to discuss a couple of quotations from literary sources that often come up in Agnes Callard's writing, very philosophical writing about marriage. The first is from a short story titled The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by the writer Ursula K. Le Guin. Now, in this story, I won't go into the story, but roughly there's a very key idea. The premise of the story lends itself to many popular ways of thinking about marriages, and especially marriages that are slightly unconventional or which have a more philosophical and an experimental side. In this story by Ursula K. Le Guin, there's a utopian city where everyone's happiness depends on the suffering of one child who is locked in a dark cellar, abandoned and starving. Now, in several interviews and in scholarship on it, scholars have tried to understand where this idea itself came from. And Ursula K. Le Guin has admitted that while writing it, she did not know it, but later in her life, she acknowledged that she must have got it from a reading of Dostoevsky, in whose novel, The Brothers Karamazov, this idea is presented as a very powerful thought experiment. And it's a religious idea. It's about Christianity and its relationship to pain and suffering. And I think it is Alyosha who presents this. It's been a while since I read The Brothers Karamazov myself, but I remember this idea very powerfully. It's presented as a thought experiment in which one of the brothers asks one of the others and says, would you be okay or would you be comfortable living in a world in which peace and prosperity was guaranteed, that all suffering was removed. But the condition was that one child, one lonely child, would be lonely and starving. There will be no other suffering, no other pain in the world. And of course, it's a painful and an impossible to answer philosophical question. And in several appropriations of this idea, several reflections on what makes marriages work, or the kinds of compromises that are needed for marriage to work, that Agnes Carla was often offered and which she examined, it was suggested to her that maybe this is true of marriages, that for marriages to be truly philosophical, truly open, and to then sustain despite the weight of logical questioning and skepticism, it is required that one partner suffers while the other partner has their way. And Agnes Callard very vehemently refuses this interpretation and argues that that is not the case. In fact, it is a misrepresentation of the idea of a marriage in the first place. Another idea that is related to this thinking through of marriage and reinterpreting marriage, not as a sort of end goal, but as a process, comes in a session that Agnes Callard held at the University of Chicago. It's part of a series called the Night Owls sessions, in which one or two philosophers come together after dinner and host a large number of students in a up to 3 hours long conversation on a philosophical idea chosen by them. Agnes Callard hosted a night owl session in which the subject was divorce, and she invited her first husband, that is Ben Callard, to this conversation. And the question that the two philosophers began with was, is it possible for a good marriage to end in divorce? And I'll just read from both of their responses. Agnes Callard posited a response to this question by saying, it is very possible for a good marriage to end in a divorce. In a lot of ways, I think we don't see our marriage as a failure. Ben Callard agrees with this and says that we need to get beyond this imagination in which divorce or the end is seen as a sort of failure, as a disappointment, as a sort of betrayal of the possibilities and the potentialities that were in place. And rather, the alternative that both these philosophers offer is that it is a process of learning and a process of growth. Just like every moment in life can be turned into an occasion for learning. Similarly, marriage also, for a philosopher, is an occasion for thinking about life, thinking about relationships in new ways. The last idea that I'll end with is also borrowed from a quotation from a literary source. This is from Rainer Maria Rilke, and I think this is from Letters to a Young Poet. Agnes Callard offers a range of literary sources which have, in some ways, solidified popular thinking about what marriages can and can't do. And for Callard, these ways are all very limiting because they approach marriage in a very limited frame. They see marriage as a sort of narrative, whereas what Callard would prefer is a sort of Socratic approach to marriage as a pure and an open-ended occasion to learn. So the quote from Rilke is this: I hold this to be the highest task for a bond between two people, that each protects the solitude of the other. This idea proves the hardest to dislodge for Callard because this is an idea that has come to possess a great deal of acceptance. And the idea here is that each individual has something intrinsic, something singular, and something unique inside them, which is an incommunicable core, and that should not be appropriated or violated. While that is a very noble idea, and nobody would advocate for the complete appropriation of one person to another person's ideas, for Callard, in this idea that marriage should protect the solitude is actually a sort of cop-out because ultimately it speaks to a pessimism which suggests that at the end of the day, we can't really help anyone. So the best thing we can do is not interfere too much. As opposed to this, Callard's view of marriage is that it is not simply a selfish or a pessimistic institution, but actually has the potential for ethics and can be a potentially empathetic institution as well. For Callard, the empathy and the ethics of marriage come from an approach in which individuals can treat marriages not simply as ways of coping with an essential and permanent loneliness, but rather occasions for thinking through how best one might occupy a space with another person. So, marriage as a challenge to think about how to be of best service to the intellect and the intellectual power of another person. Another final quote that I have is from Susan Sontag, which also Agnes Callard quotes, and in her long litany of quotations from literary and philosophical authorities who have maybe unwittingly but undeniably solidified a very limited idea of marriage. So from Sontag, the quote is, marriage is an institution that is committed to the dulling of feelings. The whole point of marriage is repetition. Now, against this idea, against the idea that repetition or the way that repeating something can only serve to make it dull, less unique, less interesting, less powerful, is something that Agnes Callard rejects with the idea of philosophy as a preparation for death. And this idea comes when Callard reflects on her second marriage to Arnold Brooks and realizes that she has had moments of skepticism, moments when, uncanny moments when she suspects that maybe she made a mistake, that the same process of disillusionment, realization that she has the aspiration for more, seems to be repeating itself. And that's when she reminds herself that that repetition, the lifting of the veil, the fear that maybe she's bound to repeat this process of feeling dissatisfied, inadequate with multiple partners is not failure of the institution of marriage, but rather it is the logical conclusion. It is the success. It is the process achieving its aim of providing a truly philosophical education. And this is how Agnes Callard describes these moments of skepticism, potential dissatisfaction in her second marriage. Maybe our marriage is a preparation for divorce. The thing we're trying to do is approach that fact that another person could be so deeply tied to the meaning of your life that without the relationship, life might feel meaningless. And then she goes on, I think a lot of our fights boil down to thinking he's already arrived at the final condition where he doesn't need me anymore, and me trying to prove out to him that he's not as great as he thinks he is, so that he can see that he actually still does need me. And that actually is a way of understanding how marriage is a preparation for divorce. It is a preparation for the time when you won't need another person in order to think. So, the shaping influence that Socratic ideas have on Callard's thinking about marriage, Callard writes, when Socrates says that philosophy is a preparation for death, he's very clear that he doesn't mean you're supposed to commit suicide. It's just that there's some way in which philosophy could stand up to the task of making you able to deal with death when it comes. The corresponding claim would be that somehow the project of marriage would make you more capable of being alone. Now, I'll briefly connect this to Iris Murdoch's ideas of fiction before wrapping up this lecture and returning to some more thoughts on Murdoch and the novel in the next one. So, this idea that marriage is a project that educates us and prepares us in being alone sounds like a somewhat selfish and maybe like a crazy person's view, or something that is so impractical that only a very privileged philosophy professor can indulge these ideas. One of the things I've tried to clarify is that these are not the preserve of elite philosophy professors, whether they are dons at Oxford or whether they're at the University of Chicago. Rather, they are important ways of thinking and being, and they have the power to shape not only how we think about our lives, but also how some writers can use this very important structure of feeling to create worlds in their fiction. Iris Murdoch did not write publicly about the sort of openness and the radical freedom with which she explored the meanings of marriage, friendships, and relationships. Her biographers continue to fight about reputation and the legacy of the life that she lived after her death. While that is amusing to read, it's important to approach Murdoch's fiction with some of the philosophical openness and some of the radical, skeptical, and ultimately empathetic ideas that one finds in the work of Agnes Callard. I'll return to Iris Murdoch and move on in our series of novelists in the next lecture. Thank you.